Thanks to Mary and thanks to everyone for coming along today. I'm really delighted to be giving this introductory talk for today's event, and also slightly guilty because I have been given more time than the other speakers, and I hope they won't bear a grudge against me for that. What I'm going to try to do is to just establish some historical points of reference for today's discussions, and more specifically to highlight the value of an historical appreciation of the emergence of broadly new ways of understanding and measuring the purpose of universities, which became prominent in the policy community and in public discourse more generally from the early 1960s. Now, one implication, I think, of the argument I'm going to present is that, as Mary signalled, that in certain respects, the Brown Review and the current government's higher education bill do represent, as well as clearly a very significant new turn in policy terms, but also actually represent the culmination of a long-standing, quite complex shift in the understanding of the rationale and character of universities in policy and political circles. Discussions such as today's are quite clearly highly valuable, and I want to propose, if you like, a second aim of this talk is to propose that some part of them might helpfully be devoted to exploring connections with, and indeed disconnections from, the very different characterizations of universities that prevail in the policy and political worlds that I'm going to discuss. In other words, it's that sense of what's the relationship between our understandings, and they are of course multiple, of the rationale and history of our own subjects, and the ways in which those who've made these very important decisions about funding, about the frameworks within which universities operate, how they think as well. So let me turn to the historical sketch of changing patterns of political thinking that I want to present. Now, it's pretty well known that higher education in the UK became the focus of much more overt political conflict and public debate during the late 1960s, notably in relation to the student protests of 1968, 1969, and a wider sense, I think, amongst many on the left and across to the right, that contests over the character of universities and the forms of intellectual scholarship and teaching practiced within them carried considerable cultural and ideological significance. Here's the right-wing columnist Paul Johnson writing in 1975, in typically restrained and modest form, of course. The battle for personal liberty in Britain may be won or lost in the lecture rooms of the universities. The university now stands in the front line of civilization. Now, of course, Johnson was over-egging, as he normally did, but that sentiment actually did echo, I think, in different respects across the political spectrum in that period. And yet, politicisation was actually well underway before 1968. The significant expansion of universities and of the students going to them, which had been overseen by previous governments, and also, I think importantly, the spillover from an increasingly polarised set of debates about secondary level education, particularly in the context of the 1964 Labour government's reforms in that area, did, I think, have an important effect in spilling over into debates about and perceptions of universities themselves. Now, whilst these were the issues that took centre stage politically, what I want to suggest is that actually the terms in which universities were considered excuse me, were increasingly being set by the steady rise to prominence of three distinct but also overlapping ideas about their rationale. And it's these ideas and the interplay between them which I think has exerted a growing stranglehold upon the ways in which policymakers and politicians have come to think about universities. So let me quickly sketch them for you. The first is really a set of arguments about the university's position in what increasingly from the sort of mid-1960s came to be characterised as a novel paradigm within the development of Western society, shaped by the displacement of the institutions and values of mass industrial society, the emphasis upon new knowledge-based processes, new communications technologies and their import, and the growing consensus that a new kind of economic paradigm was beginning to develop, which required workers with better generic skills, higher levels of technical accomplishment in areas such as IT and different forms of scientific expertise. This vision, which we know now through terms such as the knowledge economy, steadily gains ground from the mid-1960s and becomes a feature of policy thinking, certainly from the early 1980s. And the emphasis upon universities as crucibles and pioneers for the development of an emergent economic order was increasingly connected, I think, in the UK with the project of a state-directed programme for economic renewal. And that's, I think, particularly important because, or particularly attractive to sections of the political elite, many of whom are gripped by a growing sense of declinism, a growing sense of anxiety about where Britain is heading in the context of being a state after empire in which, in relative economic terms, decline seems to be the present experience for the economy as a whole. And that's certainly the predominant focus, actually, of the Thatcher administrations in higher education, and then is pursued in a slightly different way by the Blair administration thereafter. That's the first sort of broadly developing idea that I think is highly important. The second is a growing egalitarian emphasis upon universities as significant public institutions as opposed to more independent entities that need to be opened up in terms of numbers and the social background of applicants, and that need to have their formerly elitist cultures dismantled. And that, I think, connects with a growing contention, which I think broadly runs across left and right, actually, that higher education institutions ought to promote a more meritocratic public culture and enhance social mobility, that last being a more recent emphasis. So whilst the polytechnics were established in the 1960s with vocational and access issues much more to the fore in terms of their mission, what very simply, very crudely put, happened was they were gradually subsumed within a broadly singular policy framework, the same framework that was applied to universities, and the same expectations and sense of direction was impressed upon them, even though they clearly lacked the resources that were given to universities at the same time. So what doesn't happen in this period, as does happen elsewhere, is that Britain does not have a sense of differentiation developing across different types of institutions on a kind of broadly level playing field, in, if you like, a horizontal sense. Britain is much more characterised by, yes, differentiation, but it's much more vertical in its character, if you like. It's more like a pyramid than it is like a sort of more horizontally organised domain. Also important in promoting this sort of broadly egalitarian sense of what universities were about were, I mean, clearly important, were both social democratic thinking and the residuum of early 20th century liberal ideas, but also a new form of liberalism, which is self-styled economic liberalism, which took its bearings from Friedrich Hayek, and which was actively promoted by organisations such as the Institute for Economic Affairs from the late 1950s. And this strand married aggressively pro-market thinking with a sustained critique of the supposedly regressive nature of the funding allocated to students, and indeed of the elitist ethos of the top universities. That second sort of current is, I think, supplemented and to some degree challenged by a third, and that's a more avowedly pro-market emphasis within the policy world. This, I think, importantly, actually predates the Brown Review by several decades. And, I mean, the sort of most obvious example, I think, and indeed one of the sort of origins of this thinking in the UK are a number of publications produced by the IEA, I mentioned the Institute for Economic Affairs, commissioned by them, typically produced by economists. And I mean, one of the things I was doing in my fellowship at CRASSH was sitting in the UL reading these pamphlets with a copy of the Brown Review next to me, and I began to realise that I wasn't quite sure, which idea was coming from where. The degree to which the current proposals were anticipated by those publications, most of which were produced by the end of the 1970s, is really quite remarkable. So in that sense, these are not, the current developments are not brand new. More important, though, I think, than those specific proposals, because Hayekian thinking was still very much marginal in the 1960s and 70s, more important was how I think right-wing opinion, conservative opinion, began to harden against government funding for universities in this period. I think that's a highly significant development. It's reflected and promoted a widely held belief that the integrity of universities, typically signalled by the ubiquitous concept of freedom, the sense was the integrity of these institutions is being compromised by the alien ideas that have been introduced into the academic monastery because the state is both the leading funder and also the provider of higher education. A third strand within this sort of broader push towards the market that I also think is important and has been rather sort of overlooked is that a number of key figures within universities, senior figures and particularly former vice-chancellors, there's a sort of minor literary genre of vice-chancellors who retire and then write books about universities, in which obviously I highly recommend to you all, but which, several of which begin to focus especially on costs, rising costs, and I think an astute observation that it is becoming ever harder within central government to justify spending on higher education, as both because costs are rising within it, but also because costs are rising, demands are rising in other competing policy areas, namely health, defence, other parts of the education budget. So there's a kind of sort of pragmatic recognition here of the difficulties. A number of those texts, and particularly a number by economists, begin to argue that actually the costs need to be shared, that students need to pay fees. And again, these arguments go right back to the start of the 1960s. And they are not, I think it's important to say, just associated with the political right. I think these kind of arguments actually cut across conventional political alignments. And I think this strand of thinking illuminates one reason why the funding of higher education is increasingly tied in government thinking, in the sort of official documents that I've been looking at, to the private benefits that will accrue for those who go through it. In other words, the idea of the graduate dividend becomes a very salient theme within policy thinking, actually from the late 1970s, and I think arguably before Thatcherism, before Thatcher actually comes to power. And what happens is it sits typically very awkwardly alongside ideas of the public benefit, the public goods that higher education is supposed to supply. And of course, the public good for higher education is typically increasingly couched in economic terms. So that's the broad story I want to tell. I think it means that the proposals aired both in the Brown Review itself, but also particularly the figure in the bill that's gone through Parliament, could, in a sense, I think, have emerged from any of the three main parties, with different emphases for sure, and clearly the circumstances in which they're introduced would have made an effect. But I think it is important to see that certainly a left-right divide is not a salient driver, I think, of the kind of positions taken by parties, the sorts of forms of thinking that dominate in this area. Caught in the crossfire of these three emergent perspectives, inherited understandings of the purpose and role of higher education appear to have crumpled, at least within the policy world and I think to a degree within public discourse. And it seems to me that their absence in mainstream politics and certainly in politicians' perceptions or politicians' belief that talking about the educative or the cultural dimensions of universities would just not have popular traction. It's those features of the current debate that I think need to be given much greater emphasis and have to a degree been obscured by the emphasis upon funding and repayment. So, some concluding thoughts, because I'm aware that the red cards might start flying any moment. Assuming that the historical dynamic leading to the current government's decisions is couched or is best seen in terms of the inexorable rise of a kind of neoliberal master ideology. Making that assumption seems to me to be both misplaced. I think it is slightly historically or somewhat historically inaccurate. I also think it is potentially self-defeating. The problem with, I think, giving too much accord to the notion that neoliberalism has swept all before it in HE as it has done elsewhere, is that it actually, amongst many other things it does, it effaces, I think, our sense of the possibilities for change and indeed for the exercise of agency. Which is not to say, of course, that, because I do think this, that if you like a sort of market-based fundamentalism has come to the fore in very recent times. I think the history is better seen in terms of the diffusion of these contending perspectives about universities, which are sometimes in tension and sometimes overlap. And I think there is, for instance, a continuing worry, actually, amongst the political elite, amongst political parties, about the degree to which these proposals do represent, in the language that Stefan Collini has used, an enormous gamble in terms of the future relationship, the future capacity of the British economy, in terms of the relationship between higher education and economic competitiveness. So even on that particular ground, which we may not necessarily think is the most important thing about universities, it does seem to me there is a potential important fault line, actually, within policy debate here. Three more specific lessons, it seems to me, that I'd like to just draw your attention to based on my account and offer to you for consideration. It does seem to me that the three perspectives I've sketched do, in broad terms, both reflect and contribute to a growing emphasis upon the economic in terms of how policymakers and politicians think about universities. I think that's just undeniable. I do think it's important that we retain a sense that the economic is not synonymous with neoliberalism. And whilst it clearly can be, and there are clearly highly influential neoliberal accounts of the economy and of markets, it does not seem to me necessary, or indeed correct, for us to, in conceptual terms or even in empirical terms, to think of the economy on the one hand and culture and education as entirely antithetical. And I think actually, I mean, just there are many different examples one might draw on of that, but if you just think about those arts-based universities, or universities with considerable arts, humanities core to them, social science core, in different parts of the country that have actually made vital contributions both to their local economies and also to the sense of civic pride and the civic identity of the places in which they are located. I think there are all sorts of opportunities here for the creation of synergies and virtuous circles. However, it is also the case, I think, that there has quite clearly been a significant narrowing of the ethical and educational ambitions for universities amongst the policy-making community. And it's also clear that higher education's relationship to the economy, even in my broader and disaggregated sense of it, has been framed in an ever more instrumentalised and frankly quite crude relationship within policy thinking. And that obviously clearly constitutes a huge challenge for those of us involved in areas such as the arts, humanities and social sciences. And it seems to me that there is a clear need for academics to challenge such thinking, difficult as that clearly is going to be. In part, we do this, of course, by events such as today, thinking about the history of and rationale for the subjects we teach and study. I also think in these debates, we ought to think hard about audience, about which are the publics that we think we can reach in the arguments that we make when we do turn, if you like, outside rooms such as this and try to speak in a more subconsciously public vein. It seems to me there are different ways of doing that. We also potentially have far more allies, and to use the dreadful term stakeholders, than we perhaps think. We have a significant growing proportion of younger people who've gone to university or are in university or want to go to university. We have their families. And I think the sense that there are many people out there who will have a relationship with universities that is likely to mean that they are more amenable to the kinds of arguments about what we do within universities is something I think we shouldn't give up. Beyond that, and the more substantive final point, is that it seems to me that what we really should try to explore is whether there are alternatives to two abiding temptations, I think, in this sort of debate. On the one hand, clearly one way, one form of response here is to attempt a form of assimilationism, in which we try to justify the arts, humanities, in the terms that are set by government. In other words, I mean, it's some of the reports that have come out recently about the economic valuation of art subjects and the value of languages and so on. I'm not deriding those. I actually think that is part of the kind of response that ought to be made. I don't think it's sufficient, and I think the danger is that we will attempt to justify ourselves and what we do on terms which mean that we can never win, which mean that we are always bound to lose in comparison with other subjects. That's one temptation here. The other, I think, is a sense that we just turn away in disgust. And I think that may connect with my point about the sort of master ideology of neoliberalism. I mean, I fully understand why people think of these things in those terms, and there are elements of truth to that. But it seems to me that if we, in a sense, give up on public discourse, and even indeed on political debate, cramped and confining and very difficult as that is now and is going to be for some while, then it seems to me that actually we are in danger of giving up on part of the challenge. We're just refusing, I think, to accept part of the challenge that does lie before us. And I think actually that is an abiding temptation, one that we ought to fight against. What I'd like to sort of leave you with is the thought that I'm sure today's discussions will generate many interesting, important ideas. I really hope that they may spark debate about the forms of thinking that emerge between and beyond those two ultimately defeatist choices. Thank you very much.